All right. So last time we talked about the reasons why Europeans decided to venture out to the New World. We talked about how Spain becomes one of the biggest powers in the Americas after the Treaty of Tordesillas. And today, what we're going to do is we're going to explain how Spain was able to conquer this massive empire, conquer and build this massive empire in the Americas, and how they ruled it. And we're also going to talk about the impact of that rule on the indigenous peoples of the Americas. All right, so let's do a little recap. So we know that the Europeans explored the Americas in pursuit of God, gold, and glory. We know that gold or profit was one of the biggest motives there. Now, based on these motivations, how do you think the explorers reacted to the people they found in the New World? So think about this. You want to convert people, you maybe want to take their money, you want to conquer them in pursuit of glory. How are you going to react to these people? How are you going to treat them? All right, so before we even talk about that and about how Spain conquered its empire, let's talk about the people who were there before the Spanish. So we're going to start off with North and Central America, and then we'll get to South America. So one of the big names that we need to know of empires that ruled North and Central America before the Spanish got there is the Maya. So they ruled this area called the Yucatan Peninsula in what is today Mexico. So if you've ever been to Cancun, that's where that is. And their civilization actually collapsed in around the year 800. So that's well before the Europeans even got there. But they were one of the big empires that sort of laid a foundation there. And there are still plenty of Maya folks around today. And then after the Maya came the Aztecs, and they ruled in a slightly different place in Mexico. But they did come to control a really big part of what is today Mexico. And their rule began at around the 1100s or so. And the Aztecs were definitely, I would call them civilized. They built cities, they built roads, there was a system of trade and language and all of that. As we'll find out, the Europeans definitely did not perceive them as civilized, but they were. And they ruled based on this system of tribute. So their capital was in this place called Tenochtitlan. They ran around capturing and conquering people around them, and then they forced them to pay tribute to them in the form of gold and silver. And what that did is it made the Aztec Empire really wealthy, but it also caused some problems. It made them really disunified. So the people who were conquered were not at all happy about that, as you can probably imagine. So there were a lot of folks who were not satisfied with Aztec rule, and that's going to set them up for failure. All right. So the Spanish arrive in what is today Mexico in the Aztec Empire in 1519. So that's about 30 years after Columbus, right? So he came over about 1492. So Europeans have been in contact with the Americas for about 30 years by the time Cortez gets to the Aztec Empire. And when he gets there, the king of the empire, Montezuma, or rather Moctezuma is an old saying of his name, Moctezuma is initially really friendly. He likes these new visitors. He's intrigued by them. And he gives Cortez and his men gifts. And by gifts, we mean gold. So Cortez sees an opportunity here, right? He is mainly motivated by glory, right, and gold. God is not as big an issue for him. And so he's very excited about this. And so what he does is he decides essentially to conquer the Aztecs for Spain. And there are three factors that help facilitate this. And the first we've already kind of talked about. So the Aztec Empire is very divided. Cortez exploits those divisions. He allies with those conquered people. He turns them against Moctezuma, and Tenochtitlan and gets them to overthrow it, right? And then once he's done with them and they've outlived their usefulness for Cortez, then he turns on them. Now, another factor that helps Cortez is that the Spanish have guns. The Aztecs do not. And this is actually going to be a really common theme when we talk about Europeans conquering other people. Actually, well up until the 19th century, a lot of times the Europeans are really good at guns, and that helps them out. And then the final factor that helps them out is disease. So this actually, smallpox came to Mexico before Cortez even got there, because again, Europeans have been kind of going back and forth for 30 years before Cortez got there. So when Cortez got there, the Aztec Empire has really already been significantly weakened. Like some people have compared it to like this almost post-apocalyptic scene. So that's probably, or one of the reasons why Moctezuma may have welcomed Cortez, is he's like, what the heck has happened? Is this person maybe, are they coming to help us? They were not. Sorry. And Tenochtitlan falls in 1521. All right, so there's our principal figures here. There's Cortez, and then there's Moctezuma, whose name I keep saying wrong. Sorry, Moctezuma. All right, so that was North and Central America. Let's turn our attention south to South America. So the empire that ruled before the Spanish here were the Inca Empire. And they're actually really similar to the Aztec Empire in that they ruled based on that system of tribute. So they would go around and conquer people nearby them and then force them to pay tribute in the form of gold and silver. So again, just like that caused problems for the Aztecs, it's going to cause problems for the Inca too. And actually, a lot like the Aztecs as well, disease is going to cause problems for the Inca. So again, the Europeans are going to bring smallpox, and smallpox actually kills off the Incan emperor. So where we had Cortez as the conqueror in the north, our conqueror in the south is Pizarro. So when he gets to the Inca Empire, the emperor has just died, and there's a massive succession crisis in between his two sons. So that's adding to all this chaos and weakening the Inca and really setting Pizarro up for success. So in addition to that, as with Cortez and the Aztec, Pizarro also had guns, right? So he does the same thing as Cortez. He makes allies with conquered peoples. He gets them to rise up against those two sons who are fighting with each other. And then he turns on his former allies once they have served their purpose for him. And the Inca Empire is going to collapse a little bit later than the Aztec Empire. So they collapse in 1535. So just to sum up, the winning formula here for the Spanish is guns plus disease plus internal weakness, and that leads to success for the Spanish. So how does Spain rule this new empire that they have just gotten through ill-gotten means? Well, the system that they use is called the encomienda system. So what the Spanish do is they set up these large plots of lands and they start farming, but they don't use Spanish labor to farm these lands. They basically capture the indigenous peoples and make them work the lands, and they also force them to pay tribute. Now, in return, the Spanish do give them money, so I'm not really sure how that system is supposed to work. You give people money, and then they pay it back to you in tribute, so who knows what's going on there. I believe the indigenous peoples were paying actual gold back to the Spanish, because we'll find out there's a reason why the Spanish were really obsessed with gold, and it's not just because it was valuable. There's a whole thing about it. But yeah, so the Spanish are supposed to treat the indigenous people's wages, or supposed to give the indigenous people's wages. They're supposed to treat them kindly, and they're also supposed to convert them to Christianity, because we know that was one of the factors motivating exploration. But this doesn't go well at all, right? Because remember, smallpox and other European diseases are still spreading, and that's killing off a lot of these indigenous workers. And as you can imagine, right, if you're working people really hard, you're not treating them very well. That puts a lot of stress on your body, which is going to lower your immune system and make disease even worse. So the system doesn't work very well, first of all, and it's so horrifically violent that even other Spanish people are really shocked and outraged. So in 1542, so not long after really the Americas have been conquered, the Spaniard named Bartolome de las Casas comes over and he sees what's happening and he writes this expose of the treatment of indigenous peoples. And this horrifies people back in Spain, and it even horrifies the Spanish government and prompts them to put a stop to the encomienda system. Now, there are some historians who think that De las Casas was kind of exaggerating what was happening. I mean, that's one of the things that journalists who are writing exposés sometimes do, right? That's one of their purposes is to make an argument to not do this thing. So sometimes they're motivated to kind of exaggerate a little bit. But what it did is that it led and actually it was so bad that it led some other Europeans, so especially the British, to paint Spain as really special and evil and cruel, but other Europeans are really not that much better. And one thing I do want to note too is that even really well-meaning Europeans like De las Casas didn't really view indigenous peoples all that favorably. So people other than De las Casas, so all Cortez and his conquistador buddies, right? They view the indigenous peoples as like these savage, uncivilized bad guys, right? Because if you're conquering someone, you want to paint them as not good people. De las Casas, even though he wanted them to be treated better, he didn't really view them as more civilized. He kind of viewed them as uncivilized in a different way. He viewed them as kind of like innocent and childlike. This stereotype is sometimes called the noble savage stereotype, and it's actually De las Casas is gonna start it, and it's actually gonna keep popping up in Europe for a really, really long time. So we'll see it come back again and again. All right. So, what does Spain do in response after it ends the encomienda system? So, what it does is it actually splits its territory in the Americas into two parts, each governed by a viceroy. So, there's New Spain, which is in the north, and then Peru, which is in the south. But really, it's too little, too late. It doesn't really do much to help the indigenous peoples. So, they've already been hit really hard by the poor treatment in general and disease. And just as an illustration of that, the population of central Mexico declined from 11 million people in 1519 when Cortez made contact to 2.5 million at the end of the century. So in 80 years, that is about like 8 million deaths there. So that's really substantial. And just to put that in perspective, the Holocaust killed somewhere around 10 million people. So lots of people spread out over a longer period of time than the Holocaust, but still a lot of people. But as you can imagine, right, the Spanish landowners who had benefited from the encomienda system were not happy about that, right? They've just lost their source of cheap labor. They can't go basically force indigenous peoples to work anymore. So what do? They turn to another source of cheap labor, the African slave trade, which we will talk a little bit about more next time.